and welcome to the post-Midwest Gaming Classic edition of Zilog and Moto. The Midwest Gaming Classic doesn't really have anything to do with this video, but it was last weekend, and after not attending for basically 2.5 years due to the pandemic, it was really great to see it back, and I enjoyed myself immensely, along with picking up 14 games for the collection. I shot some video of the convention, and maybe I'll use it in something down the line, but I don't have anything planned at the moment. However, if you're curious about the convention and maybe attending in the future, John Riggs did a pretty nice video about it and hanging out in Milwaukee in general, so definitely go check that out if you're interested. But let me step back for a minute. I mentioned picking up 14 games for the collection, and if you're not familiar with Zilog and Moto, you might be wondering what the hell I'm talking about. Well, about 3 years ago, I noticed that while there's tons of videos out there for Nintendo-related products, for instance, the bulk of the Pat the NES Punk and Angry Video Game Nerd libraries, there wasn't really nearly as much out there in regards to Sega. At least it's United States-based anyway. I see you guys out in the UK putting out the content. Anyway, I had started collecting for the 8 and 16-bit Sega platforms of the Master System, Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X, and I figured, hey, as long as I'm collecting all these games anyway, I might as well actually do something with them besides just let them sit and collect dust on the shelf. Why don't I play and review all of them as well? And thus, Zilog and Moto was born, named for the main CPUs in the Master System and Genesis respectively. I plan on collecting and reviewing all of the English language games for those 4 platforms, usually uploading one per week, so if that sounds interesting to you, I'd recommend you subscribe so we can go on this journey together. During that first year of Zilog and Moto, I reviewed a game that was an arcade port of a very famous title, and part of the reason why it was one of my earliest Sega CD reviews was because I was very curious to see how well the developers pulled off the Sega CD version as compared to that original, due to it originally being a Laserdisc-based game. That game was Dragon's Lair, a game that pretty much any gamer that was alive in the 80s had heard of due to how popular an arcade machine it was, and due to the myriad of alternate versions that the game had, with some being notorious derivations like the NES release. In fact, the Sega CD version is notable because it was the first appearance of the game on a console that accurately represented the arcade version due to its ability to use the CD-ROM to store the full-motion video sequences. Well, Dragon's Lair isn't the only game from the minds of Rick Dyer and Don Bluth, aka Bluth Group, to appear on the Sega CD. This week's review focuses on their second arcade game, Space Ace, and its corresponding release on the console. As you can probably tell based on the name of the game, Space Ace is thematically different from Dragon's Lair, swapping the fantasy nature of the original game for a sci-fi affair, very reminiscent of many television shows and movies from the era. And in fact, at first look, it appears that Space Ace is simply a sci-fi themed remake of the original game, which I'm guessing probably contributed to Space Ace not being as popular a title. But is that really the case? Is this just Dragon's Lair with phasers and spaceships? And how did the conversion of the Sega CD fare? And is it better than the port of Dragon's Lair, which released a year earlier? Well, I'll take a look at all that and more, but first, a look at the package.
Upon seeing this close-up, you might notice that it appears to be in very good condition. Like, really good, in fact. And there's a reason for that. You see, this isn't my first copy of Space Ace. No, unfortunately, I originally purchased Space Ace at either C2E2 or Wizard World, I don't remember which, here in Chicago, along with 3 or 4 other games. It's not that uncommon to see people selling video games at comic book conventions, at least the larger ones, so I usually do check around while I'm there to see if anyone has anything good. The problem is, with those big shows, usually they're pretty packed, and sometimes you might find yourself rushing to look at things, and that's what happened to me, as I really only looked at the outside of Space Ace, saw that it was complete, and grabbed it. The problem is while it technically had the manual, internally the manual had massive water damage, and the pages were all stuck together. And of course I didn't figure this out until I got home from the convention. Huge disappointment, but it was my own fault for not being thorough, so there's your lesson of the day for the budding collectors out there. Anyway, due to getting burned on that copy of Space Ace, I went to eBay and very specifically looked for the best copy I could find at the time, out of spite, and this is it. The extra large jewel case is fully intact, no damage to either of the hinges, and just some very minor scratching on the surface, and the inside is just as good as the outside, as we'll get to in a minute. As far as the cover art goes, this is pretty great. Granted, some of this design comes directly from the artwork on the original arcade machine, but it just goes to show how good Don Bluth and his team was at art design. Seeing this cover definitely makes me want to play the game, and I can imagine kids thinking the same thing when they saw it on the shelf. They also managed to make the artwork fit the space on the cover extremely well, along with the logo at the top, and that's something that not all Sega CD releases got right, due to the somewhat skinny rectangular shape that they had to work with. Flipping over the back, and again, the design back here is solid as well, with 4 good quality screenshots on the right, and then some flavor text to the left, and a nice, stylish presentation, with everything at a slight angle, while still being very readable. The screenshots make the game look fantastic, and honestly, almost too good, so I'll be curious to see if it actually does look that good, just due to the fact that Dragon's Lair definitely showed some of the limitations that the Sega CD had with digital video. The flavor text is solid as well. I really like this line in the middle. Armed with only a laser gun, Ace must find and destroy the Infanto Ray, rescue Kimberly, and save the Earth. That's pretty badass, and sounds like something you'd hear a narrator say on a blockbuster movie trailer. Opening the case up, and you'll see why I said this copy was in great shape on the inside as well. As you can see, it still has the original foam rubber spacer on top of the disc in the tray. The manual's in similarly excellent condition, and looks like it's barely been used. As far as the contents of the manual go, there's not a ton here, which is to be expected, as like Dragon's Lair, while Space Ace was a fantastic looking game in the arcades for the time, its gameplay isn't terribly deep, so as a result, the manual just has a page or two on how to play the game, and it's off you go. Although, just like with the Dragon's Lair manual, ReadySoft was nice and included some descriptions of each of the scenes you'll encounter, giving you some tips on what you might need to do to proceed. One last small thing I'll mention though, if you check the back of the manual, there's an ad for the originally planned release of Dragon's Lair 2, which of course never made it to the Sega CD, but instead did get a CDI version. Go figure. Okay, that's a really nice copy of Space Ace, but what about the actual game? Well, let's take a look. Space Ace is Bluth Group's and Cinematronics' second effort, and while it's not the true sequel to Dragon's Lair, with that being the aforementioned Dragon's Lair 2 Time Warp, it has to be considered at least in the Dragon's Lair family with its creative basis. With both games featuring video from Bluth Group, the visuals in both games have a similar art direction, and if you were to see both machines on an arcade floor side by side, it's instantly recognizable that they're from the same artists and designers. The heroes Ace and Dirk could be cousins from a different dimension, and Kimberly, while having lots more personality than Princess Daphne, still serves as a rather fetching damsel in distress type. Also, some of the monstrous aliens in Space Ace resemble foes that were in Dragon's Lair, blurring the lines between the games even further. It's not just the art styles and presentations that are shared between the two games. Dragon's Lair was released in the arcades in June 19, 1983, and Space Ace would appear on December 21, 1983, just 6 months later. As a result, both games run on the exact same arcade hardware more or less. This isn't that surprising, considering both games' underlying Laserdisc basis, and there's plenty of other arcade games out there that run on the same family of hardware, simply with different ROM sets. In fact, they're so similar that an arcade operator had the choice of buying a new dedicated Space Ace cabinet, or buying just a replacement EEPROM that contained the Space Ace code, the Space Ace Laserdisc for the video sequences, and of course, the Space Ace cabinet artwork. Between the similar visuals of the two games, and a gameplay that matched up between the two machines, Space Ace was ideal for the Dragon's Lair fan that had mastered the game, but now wanted a new challenge and wholly new game world to explore. However, Space Ace, while initially popular, didn't have the same lifespan as Dragon's Lair did, and I think that's pretty evident today, as while your average gamer might be familiar with Dragon's Lair, Space Ace is certainly not as widely known. The problem is when someone does something that's truly as original as something like Dragon's Lair, if there's a planned follow-up, it has to do things that are bigger and better than the original, or at very least do things in a different way to allow that follow-up to stand on its own and not be able to be compared directly to the original. This is a common issue in movie sequels and when bands release second albums after a breakthrough debut, and unfortunately, for all the reasons I've already stated, Space Ace is just too similar to Dragon's Lair to stand on its own, and I could easily see anyone that had played Dragon's Lair previously walking away from Space Ace after a few plays due to having a feeling of, I've already played that game before, why am I putting money into it again? This isn't to say that Space Ace is a lazy carbon copy of Dragon's Lair that brings nothing new to the table, although if you hadn't actually played the game, you'd be forgiven for thinking that. Just like in Dragon's Lair, Space Ace is completely controlled by a joystick for inputting up, down, left, or right, and a single action button. Also, the actual gameplay of Space Ace is exactly the same as in Dragon's Lair, with you just using the joystick and the action button to not actually navigate Ace around the screen, but to instead respond to what's happening in the video sequence that's played on the screen. For instance, in a scene that has you piloting your ship through a hallway, you might need to tap up on the joystick to trigger the next video sequence. And with any other response, including not timing that pressing up correctly, resulting in a death scene playing, and having to start the level over from the beginning. Okay, so maybe it is a lazy carbon copy of Dragon's Lair, but Space Ace does have several things that at least somewhat set it apart. One of those is the addition of voice acting. Dragon's Lair did have some voice acting. It wasn't entirely silent, but for the most part, you could have subbed in Gordon Freeman's voice actor for Dirk the Daring and not missed much. For Space Ace, while the game still relies primarily on action sequences, there are more actual scenes that flesh out the story between the characters, and especially plenty of taunting from Commander Borf when you die. The dialogue is a welcome addition to the game and does a good job at breaking up all the action, at least when you don't get stuck at a certain part of a level and have to hear, "I'll save you, Kimmy," 100 times. The other notable change between the games is caused by the main plot point of Space Ace, which is that Commander Borf has developed an Infanto Ray, which turns anyone it's fired at into a child, and Ace and Kimberly are on a mission to stop Borf from firing the Infanto Ray at Earth. At the beginning of the game, Borf manages to kidnap Kimberly and also fire the Infanto Ray at Ace, winging him and turning him into his alter ego Dexter, a seemingly nerdy teenager. As a result, you start out playing the game as Dexter, and if you want, you can actually play the whole game as Dexter. But during most of the levels, as you make your way through, during one of the sequences, you can use a special watch that you have to return yourself to Ace form and play the rest of the level as Ace, which involves a different, more complicated path to navigate, before, of course, getting turned back into Dexter for the start of the next level. I really like this aspect of the game as it gives the game some replay value that Dragon's Lair was sorely lacking, and it's just a fun idea. I found myself often switching to Ace and playing the more difficult route through the level just because it felt more heroic somehow, if that makes any sense. And while we're talking about replay value, just in case you're curious, the game does feature the inverted mode that Dragon's Lair had, where sometimes the level will play going left to right, and other times it'll play going right to left, essentially giving you 4 possible routes through the game. Okay, that's a decent amount about Space Ace in general, but what about the Sega CD specific version of the game, seeing as how this is supposed to be a review of that? Well, the first thing that stood out to me is the graphics. One of my main complaints about Dragon's Lair back in episode 33 was that it looked especially rough. Granted, the Sega CD has well-known limitations to its graphics, especially with full motion video, but even knowing that, it was somewhat hard to look at. The use of the 64-color palette was rough, and paled in comparison to the versions available on more advanced consoles like the 3DO and the Jaguar CD. Space Ace looks much better in comparison. In fact, it looks so much better, I was worried that maybe something about my gaming setup had changed in the interim to cause that, and I wasn't making a valid comparison between the two, but developer ReadySoft was nice enough to include a teaser for Dragon's Lair in Space Ace, and no, it wasn't a setup issue, it still looked just as bad. Apparently they had made advances in the year between the two games coming out that allowed for ReadySoft to better take advantage of the Sega CD hardware, and it shows. It still doesn't look nearly as good as the arcade original, and there was lots of detail lost in the conversion, but Space Ace is definitely much closer visually to the original source than Dragon's Lair was. That's the good news. Unfortunately, other than the graphical improvements that ReadySoft was able to make, the rest of the game is downhill in comparison. The main problem is how the game controls. The whole concept of Space Ace and games like it is that it's supposed to be an interactive cartoon. When action occurs on the screen, you're supposed to react to it, and in certain cases, the game gives you a clue as to what you're supposed to do by highlighting a section of the screen, indicating that you should either hit the action button or move the joystick in that specific direction. This requires the player to have quick reaction times and provides the challenge to the game. There's just one issue. The timing in the game is all messed up. There are many scenes in the game where it's literally impossible to react quick enough with what happens on the screen. This isn't a situation where split-second reflexes are required, it's a situation where having negative-second reflexes are required. The Sega CD version of Dragon's Lair has a reputation of having tighter timings on the inputs than the arcade version, and it does, but it's still playable if you're familiar with what you need to do. Space Ace is far worse, and I found myself hitting the D-pad or the action button before scenes would start just to get the game to register what I wanted to do, because waiting for the scene to play simply wasn't an option. Not all the scenes in the game are like this, but enough of them are to ruin things for me. At the very least, the game features infinite continues, so you don't have to worry about going back to the beginning. Well, except for when you're busy trying to read the fact to figure out what you did wrong in a scene, and forget to hit start to continue in time, causing the game to restart. Yeah, that was it for me. I didn't finish the game because there was no way I was going back to the first 10 levels again to get back to where I was. It was simply too annoying in most places. You might have thought I was joking about hearing, "I'll save you, Kimmy," earlier 100 times. No, not a joke. This wouldn't be as big an issue if it wasn't for the fact that Space Ace features half as many levels as Dragon's Lair, but they're longer, especially if you switch to Ace from Dexter during the level, meaning that there's many more opportunities to screw up a level and have to restart. The infinite continues are a welcome feature, don't get me wrong, but after a while, certain places feel like you're banging your head against the wall. There's also the matter of some things missing from the arcade game. I didn't mention it earlier, but one small difference Space Ace had in comparison to Dragon's Lair was the ability to choose from one of 3 difficulty levels. I believe this controlled things like the signals given to the players to what to do on the screen, and removing places where there are trick signals. I don't really mind this being gone, but if they weren't going to include the ability to choose an easier difficulty mode, they really should have fixed the gameplay so that it wasn't so unforgiving. Finally, there's also a missing level. I suppose I shouldn't be too surprised, as Dragon's Lair was missing a few sequences as well, but for some reason, level 8 isn't included in the game. There's no indication as to why it's gone, and having watched video of versions that include it, there's certainly nothing special about it as to why it wouldn't fit in the Sega CD version. Just puzzling. When I started playing Space Ace, I had high expectations, as while the Sega CD version of Dragon's Lair certainly isn't perfect, I warmed up to it the more that I played it, and genuinely felt satisfied after finishing the game, even with how short it is. And Space Ace looks better than Dragon's Lair does, hands down. Plus, the addition of character dialogue enhances the feeling of playing a cartoon. But the controls are simply broken. I shouldn't have to worry about a scenario where a level starts, and I forgot that in that particular scene, I have to be hitting left while the intro is still running to not die when Dexter appears on the screen. As a result, I'm giving Space Ace 1 star. It's unfortunate because I really do like most of the changes that were made in the arcade version coming from Dragon's Lair, and clearly they were able to use the extra year of development time to enhance the visuals, getting the most out of the Sega CD hardware, but I would have vastly preferred to have a worse looking game that was playable without having precognitive abilities.
And that's it for Space Ace. I'm not the controller throwing type. For the most part, I'm really a laid-back guy, and I'm sure playing video games probably helps keep me that way. Space Ace, however, had many points where I looked down at this controller, and I could see myself flinging it at something very hard. Not that it was the controller's fault. Oh no, it was doing exactly what I told it to. And honestly, I don't think it would have been nearly as frustrating or enraging if it wasn't for the fact that there are parts of the game that are genuinely fun. There's a level about a third of the way through that has you escaping the planet you start out on, and the game plays exactly as you would expect. There's enough time to see what buttons you should hit, and while it's still slightly challenging, it had that same satisfaction I had playing Dragon's Lair. And the next level is fun too. It seemed like that maybe it was just the first few levels being broken, and the rest of the game would be good. Then the rest of the game crashed back down, and oh well, what are you going to do? Move on to the next review, that's what. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it's time for something completely different. It's time for a game that I know nothing about, other than the genre of the game. It's so obscure that it actually was originally an unlicensed Taiwanese release in 1996, and the only reason why I have a copy of it is because Pico Interactive released a translated version of the game that I bought about 2 years ago, and so far, I haven't even opened it. This next review is going to be interesting to say the least. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.